Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Filter. On the show, we recognize that the world can be a confusing place to live in, and so what I seek to do is to equip you to live with biblical clarity in this confusing world so that you can face the chaos of life with wisdom, integrity, and courage. The national conversation on racial relations is more divided than at any time in the previous few decades. The central question is, what approach should we use to handle racial incidents, divisions, and disparities? In the midst of reactionary positions, my guest on today's show argues an approach that is founded in the Christian worldview, wisdom, as well as sociological research. His name is George Yancey, and I'm excited to have him back on the show to discuss his newest book, Beyond Racial Division, a Unifying Alternative to Colorblindness and Antiracism. George Yancey is a scholar on race and religion in America. He holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Texas and began his career studying interracial relationships and multiethnic churches. Since 2019, he has been at Baylor University working on a joint appointment in sociology and the Institute of Religious Studies. He's the author of several books, including So Many Christians, So Few Lions, Beyond Racial Gridlock, and his newest one, Beyond Racial Division, a Unifying Alternative to Colorblindness and Antiracism. Before we dive into this episode, let me encourage you to subscribe to our email list so that you can get all of the latest content sent directly into your inbox. Visit the link in the show notes and you can get signed up on my website. Also, be sure that you're subscribed to Filter wherever you get your podcasts so that you can get all future episodes right on your homepage. If you're helped by this content, we'd really appreciate it if you left us a rating and review or shared the show with your friends. Leave Filter a 5-star rating on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and also if you would, write a review for us on Apple Podcasts. It only takes a minute of your time, and when you do this, it greatly helps us to get the message of biblical clarity out to more people. Well, without any further delay, let's jump into my conversation with Dr. George Yancey. George, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, really glad to have you back. I was telling you just before that I've been looking forward to it. You're one of my favorite guests to have on here and one of my favorite scholars and voices to follow. So it's always a pleasure to get to talk to you. Let's start today. I know that you have this new program going at Baylor, which is where you're on faculty, called the Collaborative Conversations and Race Program.
Yes.
Tell us about that. What is that all about? When did it get started? What's the goal with it?
Well, part of my thinking is that if we're going to try to have a new way of approaching racial issues, we're going to need to try to work together to develop some resources. Of course, my lane is doing academic research, empirical evaluations. But we also need to find ways of creating community, learning best practices. And so since I'm fortunate enough to be here at Baylor, I wanted to take advantage of that to create a program where that could happen, where people could join, meet like-minded people. The resources from the joining would help fund research on this topic. Eventually, if it grows big enough, I would love to start developing some materials, some helpful materials that people can use. One thing I get asked again and again, I don't have a good answer for it, is how do you teach your kids to enter into the sort of collaborative conversation approach as opposed to one of the other approaches? Mm-hmm. I would love to find someone who's really good developing materials for kids, which I am not. To figure out something along those lines. I would love to use it because I have 3 young ones myself. So that's kind of what I want to do. I wanted to give an institutional framework. And so people who are interested can join. And there is a fee for joining. But eventually, as it grows, I hope that it becomes a magnet of like-minded individuals who can get together and meet other people and figure out best ways of doing things. Or meet people, you're going to a new city, maybe meet someone from that city who's also committed and find out, where they're at. So that's kind of what this idea is. And if it grows, it'll start, there'll be interesting evolutions as to what the program becomes. I would just put it that way.
Gotcha. So it'll be a center for research, but then also resourcing.
Yes, and contacts too.
Yeah. So is the target just any individuals, or is it institutions, churches?
Both can join. There is an individual membership and there is an organization membership fee, and there's certain, like I'm gonna do a newsletter probably in the summers, and so that'll go with it, and people will get a price break on purchasing the books. So there's certain advantages, as well as helping to fund research and helping to create a community where people can dialogue, talk to one another.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm excited about it. I've received some of your emails about it and looked into it, and really interested to see what comes out of it. For anyone who's listening or watching and interested in this the program, I'm going to make sure to include that in the show notes, so you guys can find the link to the program that they're starting there. But aside from that, we're talking about your latest book today, which is Beyond Racial Division. It's coming out on March 15th. People can start pre-ordering it now. That's something else we'll have in the show notes. I'm assuming so if it's coming out now, you wrote this probably in late 2020 or during last year?
I got started late 2020s doing it. And so that's, and finished it last year.
Yeah. So 2020 with in the midst of the pandemic, different events in the culture, conversations around race and racial tensions were really, really hot. And I'd say they're still pretty hot going through last year. Here we are in early 2022. What would you say? Where are we at right now? What's your view of the conversation right now in the broader culture?
Well, and I talk about this in the book. We are sort of in this cycle. So the way I describe it is you'll have a racial incident, and then you'll have a protest over that racial incident. And then eventually you get a counter protest, and then it's all messed up for a little while. Things die down and you're in an equilibrium until you get another racial incident. So we probably are in equilibrium right now. But the sad part of that is it means we've not made any progress, or we've made very little progress. Yeah. That we'll have another racial incident that will happen. Maybe it'll be tomorrow, maybe next month, maybe a couple months from now. But it will happen. And then we'll get the upsurge of protests, then we'll get the counter protests, and then we'll be back at equilibrium. And this is just a cycle that goes over and over again, and it will continue to go over and over again until we figure out how to stop it, how to break it.
Yeah. The only recent event that I can think of would be and this wasn't, I don't even know if this really counts as a racial event, but the attempt to deplatform Joe Rogan over some past comments that he had made. I think that's really the most recent debate that I can think of.
Yeah, I think, didn't it start out though? I think someone found that. I wouldn't count that as a racial event because didn't that start out with something about transgender or something like that? I'm not sure.
It started out with
vaccines.
COVID. Yeah, COVID stuff.
I'm not a Joe Rogan fan, as you can probably tell. I don't care. I mean, I don't hate him. I just don't ever listen to him.
Yeah.
I think it was something about someone about vaccines and people got all worked. So I wouldn't count that as a racial event. I mean, obviously some shootings have been racial events. There's been protests. Now, here's part of the backlash. Some of the protests at school board meetings, that's a racial event. Sometimes someone does get caught into saying something racist, and that becomes a big protest. So, those are the sort of things that we tend to get from time to time.
Yeah. So the school board, would you be referencing the CRT debates in school board meetings?
Yes, the whole CRT mess.
Okay.
Yeah, all of that was, I think that's part of the backlash. So you could say we still have some of that backlash going on. I think that's sort of receding a little bit, but I think we're gonna hear from it come in the fall.
Yes, we're going to get more specifically into exactly what is your approach and how it differs. But just while we're talking about the culture and reading the culture, what is your read of whenever you see like the debates going on at school board meetings? How do you evaluate and analyze what's going on there and critique it or whatever? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, the debates in the school board meetings, I think, reflect the sort of ongoing conflict we have in our society. So we have, and really the whole thing about CRT is CRT represents certain racial attitudes. And I think some people get it wrong. they're arguing, well, you get CRT wrong. You don't understand CRT. And that misses the whole point. It doesn't matter whether or not people understand specifically CRT. CRT represents certain racial attitudes that people either want or don't want. And when you understand that, then the whole school board fiasco is arguing over what direction are we going on race? Are we going in a direction that is represented by CRT? And notice, I'm not saying CRT itself, but represented by those sort of attitudes, or are we going the attitudes by those who protest CRT? And I think that gives you a framework for understanding the school board protests.
And so how would you articulate what that attitude is?
The attitude CRT? Well, it's the sort of the D'Angelo, and once again, before someone listens, that that's not CRT. I'm not arguing what CRT is, okay? So before someone picks it out of context, says George Yancey does not understand CRT, I'm not saying D'Angelo CRT, but that D'Angelo represents the attitudes connected that people see. D'Angelo and Kendi and all sorts of anti-racism, the DEI stuff, all of that is connected to a set of attitudes, a more proactive attitudes on how we deal with racism, a more progressive attitudes, if you will, on how we deal with racism. Those are now envisioned when people say CRT. What they don't actually mean is the legal scholarship theory that developed due to Bell and Crenshaw and and Delgado and them. What they mean is these sets of attitudes, because most people don't know about Bell and Delgado, but they know about these attitudes because they hear. I mean, who's not heard about white fragility by this point in time? We all have, and we all have probably a decent awareness of what it's about. But and so that's how I see CRT. Yeah,
interesting. Yeah, so you have this new book coming out. This one is called Beyond Racial Division. It's not your first book on the topic. You have a previous one called Breaking the Racial Gridlock, and a few other.
Gridlock, yes.
Breaking racial. Is that right? Breaking racial.
Beyond Racial Gridlock. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. But anyway, so this isn't your first one on this topic. How does this one stand out? What was different from the previous works in this newest book?
Well, interesting story on that. So as you stated, I was writing this book in 2020. And of course, 2020 is when you had Ahmaud Arbery and when you had George Floyd and all that. And really, I had not really written anything on race for about 15 years. And I really had made the big mistake of telling God, I'm never writing on race again. Always big mistake. Don't tell God never. So when that happened, it really kind of, for some reason, because these things happen, unfortunately, but for some reason it kind of got to me, and I sort of pulled away for a little while, for about 4 or 5 weeks. Got off social media, didn't pay attention to the news. And when I decided to connect back, all of a sudden there's a lot of interest in Beyond Racial Gridlock. And the ideas, which I kind of had written, still believed, but no one was doing anything with them. So I sort of was, okay, I'm off to my own thing now. And now a lot of people were really interested in it. That eventually led my wife to saying, you know what, you should write another book. To which I said, no, I'm not writing another book. I've written a book. That was a lot of time, effort, energy to write a book. I'm not writing another book. And so we had a disagreement. She wanted me to write a book. I didn't want to write a book. We compromised. I wrote a book. So that's how basically Beyond Racial Beyond Racial Division got wrote. To describe it, I think I had 15 years between Beyond Racial Gridlock and this book. So my ideas, I think, I did not change my ideas. I refined my ideas. I also wanted a book where I wanted to look at the research. Even though it's a Christian book, I wanted to look at the research. I'm not doing original research, so this is not technically an academic book. I wanted to look at the research and see what research has said on racial issues and see whether or not my ideas about what would work is supported by the research and whether what other people were doing was not supported by the research or not. And what I found is that a lot of what people are doing in order to try to create a better racial situation has very little, if any, research support. But there is support for some of the ideas, even though it's not directly on racial issues that I'm talking about. So this gave me even more confidence that this is the better direction to go. And this is the direction I think that we as a country should go, we as a church should go, we as a church should lead the country in this direction rather than follow the country in a direction that's leading us off a cliff.
Yeah. So this might be
that's kind of where I come from on this. I also want to make this book a little more practical.
Okay.
So I try to do that a little bit more than I did on the original book.
Yeah. So this might be getting a little bit ahead, but how do you research the effectiveness of these methods or theories? In other words, how do you quantify racial progress?
Well, one way, pretty easy, is you could use a pre-test, post-test, follow-up test method. So let's say that you have a group of people that you want to see whether or not your treatment's going to be effective. So you do a pre-test of their racial attitudes, of their perspectives. You do the treatment, however long the treatment may take, and then you do a post-test. Now, the problem is if you just do a post-test, it's sort of like when you take your kids off to church camp and they come back. You know, they come back and they're cleaned up their room and they're saying, yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. And, you know, they're on fire for the Lord. And then 6 months later, their room's a mess and they go, oh, pops, you know, and everything's back to normal. So I'm not saying don't take your kids to church camp. There could be some long-term effects you don't see.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's just that energy of the moment. And what research has shown is that when people do this pre-test, post-test in 6 months and do it like a 6-month follow-up or so, that diversity training has no effect on prejudice reduction. So we're doing this sort of diversity training, and we've done this. Antiracism is not new. It was called something else. It was called interracial encounter programs, or interracial group encounters, or things of this nature. It's not new. It's just we've changed the name of it. And so we've had a lot of research done on this. And what we call meta-analysis has shown that this research basically shows that it has no real effect on racial attitudes. So that's one piece of research that one can do. There's other examples of research, but that's one piece of research that sort of illustrates to us that what we're doing is not working. Oh, and just to challenge, if someone's out there and they're saying I got it wrong, there's a very easy way to correct me. There are half a dozen, maybe more anti-racism books that are fairly popular right now, and not just D'Angelo or Nkindi. There's also so you want to talk about race. There's also White Supremacy in Me, The Bridge. So there's a lot of books out there. Read those books. What research do they cite to justify what they propose? They'll cite research showing how bad it is. They'll cite research showing, about racism. What research do they cite showing that what they propose will work? And tell me about that. Because if you can find some research, you're a better person than I am, because I could not find that research. Not any sort of, other than some small studies that you really can't generalize out. There's very little out there that says that, hey, this will actually work.
Yeah. Interesting. And so in the book, you're trying to provide a different way from these two other positions that are called colorblindness on the one hand, but then also antiracism, which you've already mentioned a few times. Before we get into your approach, could you define each one of those, what those mean, colorblindness and then antiracism, and what's the problem with each one of those approaches?
Okay, so colorblindness is the notion that the way we beat race is we ignore race. So I'm going to just treat you exactly the same as I would treat someone of my race, and race doesn't matter. In fact, the problem is when we bring up race and try to make it matter, if we just ignored race, then everything will be okay. Now, colorblindness makes sense if and only if we have a relatively fair society. In other words, if there's no real mistreatment, or if we're treating everyone exactly the same in our society by race, then colorblindness might work. But we know there's institutional factors that lead us to treating people differently on race. There's a lot of research on this. There's research that shows that driving while black is a real thing, that blacks are pulled over more than people of other races. There's research on our criminal justice system, on how Blacks and Latinos are more likely to be convicted, all other evidence being equal, serve heavier sentences, more likely to be arrested. There's research in our healthcare system showing that there's racism in attitudes and in practices. There's research on residential segregation and the pernicious effects of residential segregation that we have. Research on education outcomes, on how people of color, especially Blacks and Latino Americans, how they suffer in our educational systems. So there's a ton of research out there showing that people of color are not treated the same way. Even if people try to treat them the same way, we have institutions that work against them. Under those circumstances, then, when you're colorblind, what you're basically saying is, we have this wound, we have this problem here, and our solution is we're going to ignore the problem. And as you might well recognize, people of color think, well, that's inadequate. We have to have something to deal with the problem. So that's why colorblindness doesn't work. Anti-racism, I've already alluded to the problems with anti-racism. Let me just flesh out a little bit more what anti-racism is, because I read a lot of the pop books on anti-racism to prepare for my book. And I get, you could probably find some other commonalities, but I'll just boil it down to 3 commonalities. One, that racism is pernicious in multiple levels of our society. It's institutional, it's personal, there's a lot of dynamics of racism. 2, we have to be very proactive in dealing with racism. And we can't just sit back, we have to do something. If it was just those 2, then anti-racism sounds pretty good. But 3 is the problem. 3 is the role of whites in anti-racism is basically to do what people of color tell them to do. And if people think that I'm exaggerating this, I invite them once again to go to anti-racism books and read. Are there anything in these books that says, look, we want to hear from the opinions of whites. We want to work together. And a lot of these books talk about whites. In fact, they talk more about whites than they talk about people of color, to be honest. So they're talking about whites and what whites are to do. They're to give money to their causes. They're to sit and listen and reflect. They're to support people of color in what they do and not take a leadership role at all. I mean, these are common themes. They're to end whiteness. These are common themes in anti-racism books. So at the end of the day, it's basically whites. The job of whites is to do what people of color tell them to do. And then this becomes the core of their teachings and their approaches. And the research has shown that these sort of approaches don't work. Research has also shown that when you try to impose on people things that they don't want to accept, they don't tend, unless you have the power to force them to accept it, then they're not going to. And if you have that power, what happens when you lose that power? Then if anything, there's a backlash, which to me produces a really interesting problem. So if you have the power to force people to do what you want, but only as you have the power that will they do what you want. What does that mean? It means you must keep your power no matter what. How much damage is done by humans from the need to keep power no matter what happens? Mm-hmm. So, anti-racism sounds kind of good at the first blush, but it can lead to some really serious problems that we have to contend with.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's way more that we could dig into there, just as I'm, processing everything that you're saying. And yeah, I think you can see how there is a lot of backlash in our culture. Not just what you pointed out before in the parents protesting at school board meetings, but even in other reactions of people, like you said before, who maybe want to go the opposite direction into ignoring just any problems that we have and so on. So your proposal to these 2 different positions is called mutual accountability. So can you explain what that is?
Okay, so here's how I see it. Both the approaches I just described, colorblindness and anti-racism, they have something in common, even though they have totally different solutions. And that something in common is they presuppose that they found the right answers. And the way that we're going to have racial harmony is they're going to make everyone comply to these answers. And of course, that creates all sorts of problems. My solution is we can't force people to comply. What we can do is work with them, listen to them, and in time forge solutions where we've compromised a little, they compromise a little, we find something that we can agree upon, and then we move forward working to implement whatever that is. It's our solution. It's not the white man's solution. It's not the black man's solution. It's our solution because we've worked for it. It does mean a change of mindset. And it does mean that we have to let go of the idea that we're going to get our way completely, which I think is a good thing because humans don't work out well when they get everything they want. I don't know if you've noticed this. If you have little kids, you know this very well. So giving people everything they want is not the solution. Having us work together so that we can find something that we can bond together and move forward, that is what I think we need to do. I saw a story of someone that I've known about called Daryl Davis. I don't know if you ever heard of Daryl Davis or not. Have you heard Daryl Davis?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's this African-American man. And so what he decided to do, for whatever reason, I forget exactly how he started doing this, is that he met a guy who was Ku Klux Klan. And rather than talk about, this guy's white fragility or how he's in whiteness or how bad he is, he listened to this man and talked. And pretty soon they found they had a lot in common. And eventually, because of his friendship, because Gerald Davis, he's moral suasion, the man left the Klan and gave him his robe and he gave him his hood. According to what I've been told, Daryl Davis has done this 200 times. There are 200 less Klansmen because this one guy decided instead of cascading and trying to force them out of the Klan, I will go and I'll develop a relationship with them and essentially love them out of the Klan. Yeah. 200 less Klansmen. Now, in the big scheme of things, is that a lot? No, but for one man to do that, what sort of effect if we had more Daryl Davises out there? I'm not saying everyone's called to go in and be with the Ku Klux Klan. I'm just saying that attitude of, you're not going to be my enemy. I'm going to find out ways I can connect with you and then persuade you towards something that is better for all of us. It would totally change the way we deal with race. And if everyone did this, white, black, whoever, mutual means everyone has responsibility for the conversation. The solutions may not be mutual, but the conversation has to be.
So what do we do in the conversation whenever we are having a hard time landing in a mutual place, or I guess we could say, common space over exactly what are the problems and what are the solutions?
Yeah, and that's part of what we're going to have to figure out as we go along, because we've not had these sort of conversations nearly enough. I'm not saying we've never had them, but we've not had them nearly enough. We are going to have to try to figure these things out. And what I think will happen over time as we have more and more of these conversations is going to force us to crystallize what we truly need and what we kind of want. And sometimes you got to figure out, okay, do I really need this? Probably not. I want this, but I don't need this. Are we willing to give up what we want to get what we need? I hope we are. So I think that that's something that if we got impasse, seeing whether or not we can sit down and figure out what do I really want and what I really need. I'm certain that there's going to be some times in which we can't find agreement. We're human, and that's going to. But maybe if we even if we can't find total agreement, if we can get closer to one another and figure things out a little bit better, then even when we can't fully implement a solution, at least we can perhaps change whatever we do out there to better reflect the needs of people who are around there. Mm-hmm. And then move forward, and hopefully at some point, if not in the near future, some point figure out something that will work out for everyone.
Yeah, because whenever I look at the debates that are happening right now on these issues, and I'm also thinking specifically within a Christian context, I'm thinking of these conversations. It seems though often people can't even get to the point of a constructive collaboration or anything they would call mutual, because there is just too much debate and argument over the core foundation of the discussion, which is just that what is the problem? On one side, one person will say the problem is racism and systemic racism and whiteness, and the other person on the other side says no, the problem is CRT, everything that you're saying. And so since they can't even agree on what exactly is the issue that we need to work through, it seems like you can never really get to that point, or they're just going back and forth arguing over, like you said before, who actually understands CRT and who doesn't.
Yeah, defining the problem is going to be an important first step, trying to figure out what exactly the problem is. And trying to, we're going to have to train ourselves in order to do this. So we're going to learn how to listen to other people in a way that is productive rather than just trying to figure out a way we can argue with them. And we're going to have to learn how to communicate with other people. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the way we communicate is such where other people literally cannot hear us, that they're turned off, they cannot hear us at all. And so we just have to be very careful about that. Yeah.
If I asked for this advice, how would you help me? So whenever you do try to, from my position as a white guy, whenever I try to have a discussion with someone who's on the other side of the debate ideologically, in terms of I'm not in the CRT camp, but if I'm having a discussion with someone in the CRT camp, and I'm not trying to advocate colorblindness, but I want to have a mutual discussion, like what you're talking about. But one of the problems that I see at the outset is that it seems as though the person in the CRT can't come to the table to have the conversation because they call everybody who disagrees with them a racist. And so I'm thinking of a particular interaction I had on Twitter with someone who retweeted or posted a screenshot of something that Owen Strahan has said, and called him and all the people he had mentioned in the tweet. I can't remember who all it was. Tucker Carlson, Jordan Peterson, the British guy, Douglas Murray, calling Strahan and all these people white supremacists and racist. And so I just replied and I said, I don't think we should necessarily be calling these people racist. Like I don't think they might disagree with you, but calling them white supremacists is too far. Well, then, of course, I then got attacked as being, I think the phrase he used was a part of their filth or filthy ideologies or something like that. So someone like me, if you were to give me advice, and I know there's a lot of other people like me who've experienced this, how do we try to get that conversation started and get past that barrier whenever any kind of pushback or disagreement you have is immediately at the outset labeled as racism or white supremacy?
Okay, so here's a hard truth, and a hard truth that I've had to learn myself. Not everyone's ready for this conversation. Not everyone's even ready to begin to do the work to get into this conversation. My estimate, based on this poll that I saw, my estimate is probably about 20% of the people are so wedded to anti-racism, sounds like your friend is, that they're incapable of having this conversation. Probably about 20 to 25% of the population is so wedded to colorblindness, they're incapable of having this conversation. So we got to work with that 55 to 60% of the people who are capable of having this conversation. You can't just hit your head against the wall against someone. If a person is unwilling to even consider the perspectives of others, then they are incapable of having this sort of conversation. I am not going to waste my time with people who are incapable of having the conversation. There may be times in which I need to speak out to clarify. I know that when the book fully gets out there, I may have to debate such individuals. But if a person is incapable of having that conversation, then it's a waste of time. And I'll just say social media is not the best place for the conversation anyway.
Of course. And Twitter might be the worst.
Yeah, I think Twitter is worse than Facebook. Yes, I agree. So social media is not the best place. But even if it was, there are people that simply can't have the conversation. And I would just accept it as that. I'll also say that one key to where someone can't have the conversation is if they use, and I know that using terms such as white supremacy and calling people racist, whites racist, is a conversation stopper. It is not something that you say if you want to have a conversation. And if someone really doesn't know that and you tell them, well, I really can't go forward if you're going to be calling me a racist every time I disagree with you or something like that, and they still keep doing it, they're not ready for the conversation. We have to give ourselves the grace to say, look, this person's not ready for this conversation. it'll be a waste of my time. It'll just get aggravated. We'll just both get aggravated. I'm just going to wish them well and move on with my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we just have to do that sometimes.
Yeah. There's an added phenomenon to this, and I don't know if you have an answer, but I'll go ahead and throw it out there. In my experience, whether it's me experiencing it firsthand in a conversation or just other conversations I'm witnessing and following, it seems as though, and I'd put it at a 85 to 90% of the time, it's white people who are calling the people that disagree with them white supremacists and racist. Far more than I ever see someone who seems to be from a background of color, whether it be Black, Hispanic, or anything else, throwing that label around so casually. Why do you think that is? Why do you think, like I said, at least that's been my experience and my observation, is that it seems as though really, really often, like to me, I think it's 85, 90% of the time, it's white people calling other whites or whether, or it might, if it's a Black person who disagrees with them, calling them, all kinds of other derogatory names for disagreeing with them. Why do you think that is? Do you have a thought on that?
The two most racially progressive groups of people in the country are people of color and white progressives. And I've done some preliminary work, and they are, when you ask what different issues, they're about equally progressive to one another. They're just as, and I hate the term, but it is useful. They're just as woke as each other. So it's not that the people of color are more progressive than these progressive whites, but the rationale for it has to be different. Because why are people of color racially progressive? Well, for them, as the way that they see it, those issues really help to protect them, to protect them economically, protect them socially, things of this nature. Well, that's not the case for these white progressives. They don't need affirmative action in order to protect them economically. They're not looking forward to that. I think it's a really good question. I mean, I've kind of played around with some research. I don't have the qualitative data to really back up some of my suspicions, but I think that is a really good question. I would kind of agree with you that, I'm not going to sign a percentage. And of course, you really can't, because you only have your circle. And so that wouldn't be very valid. But I do tend to think, and there may be a way to attest this one of these days, I do tend to think that white progressives are even more willing to throw out the R word, racism, than the people of color. I may be wrong on that, but I've seen it a lot, and at the very least, I don't think they're any less likely to. Maybe they're not more likely to, but I don't think they're any less likely to call people white supremacists or things of this nature. I know that people of color who are conservative or who give them some degree of pause, but when it comes to dealing with other whites, they are very willing to engage in the sort of conversation stoppers that are problematic. And so many of them are in that camp that they're not ready to have the conversation.
Yeah. What would you say is the equivalent of the conversation stopper on the conservative side?
Oh, yeah. All right. So here's the conversation stopper on the conservative side. I don't see race. White pay attention to race. Because when you say you don't see race, to a lot of people of color, not myself, because I'm just used to it and I've developed a thick skin. When you say that, what you're saying is this very important part of your social identity is irrelevant. And that's a threatening comment for a person of color. So, yeah, I'm glad you asked. There are conversation stoppers that goes both ways. And when the sort of dismissal of race is one example. Another example, I remember talking to someone about my frustrations with our ex-president, and I brought up, the episode of him denying knowing about the Klan and David Duke, and when I finally got to the point where he admitted, okay, he doesn't know, he just blew it off. Well, he's just lying. What's the big deal about lying? So I use that as an example. When there's a racialized issue, and a white person decides to take the race out of it, when the race is clearly part of it, that's a conversation stopper. At that point, a person of color knows, well, this person does not want to understand how racism impacts me and my society. So why should I go on in the conversation with him or her?
Yeah.
So those are a couple of examples of conversation stoppers that whites and conservatives use.
Mm-hmm. I know the book is still a few weeks out, and so once it gets out there more, you'll have more feedback coming in. But really, everything you're talking about, for those who've been following you, isn't new, I think. I'm not saying there's not going to be anything new in the book, but I'm saying that you've been writing and talking about these ideas for a while. Your critiques of colorblindness and anti-racism, the mutual accountability model. What have been some of the critiques and pushback you've gotten to, whether it be your critiques of those positions and then putting forward your own?
Yeah. I think, the critiques that I've gotten, obviously it's different from whether they come from colorblindness or people who are advocates of more anti-racism. People who are advocates of colorblindness think that bringing up race is the problem. So clearly I bring up race. I think something we have to be proactive, we have to deal with. And they have a problem with that. They think that is a problem. I've had people who criticize me because I want to raise my kids to be good Black men, not just good men. So things of that nature. From those who are more anti-racist, there's a couple of things I hear. I hear people talk about how it is not fair for me to expect people of color to enter into conversation because they have so much pain. And because, of their emotional pain, that conversation is too painful. And so how dare I ask them to enter into that conversation? And then I've also heard that I'm too nice to whites, that my approach lets them off the hook per se. So, I hear those comments. I know where they're coming from. I just come to the conclusion that you can't, it's sort of like if you're married and your wife expects you to read her mind. If you're not willing to vocalize, and you can just send people off to read books. Because people read books and get the wrong idea, and then you're mad at them because they got the wrong idea. If you want people to change, you actually have to do the work. And if you can't do the work, then you can't expect people to change. So it may not be fair that if you have these emotions tied and you're expected to talk to whites, but that's the way reality is. And we can say it's not fair, but that's the way reality is.
Yeah.
As far as being too nice to whites, I have no problem critiquing colorblindness, some of the actions of some of the white people who try to ignore institutional racism. I've been a critique of Christians who I think have fallen too ready to accept people who engage in race baiting for their leaders and things of this nature. I have no problems critiquing whites. What I won't do is dehumanize whites. And if I'm saying, white person, your job is just to obey me, I'm dehumanizing the white person. If I say, whites, I need to just sort of eliminate whiteness, the culture of whites and things they're doing, I'm sort of dehumanizing whites. I won't do that. I will not do that.
Yeah.
And if I have to do that in order to win someone's approval, then the cost of their approval is way too high for me. Because is more than just hurting whites by dehumanizing them. I hurt myself when I engage in that sort of tone, that sort of rhetoric, that sort of attack. And I simply will not do that. So, and I think this is a better way. And research shows it's a better way. Research shows that this approach, and I've had successes, not always, but I've had successes reaching people by figuring out where they're at and talk to them in the language they can hear. So, it's more successful. It's more humanizing. If being nice to whites is more successful and more humanizing, then I'll be nice to whites. It's not that hard of a deal. So those are some of the critiques I've heard to date.
Yeah, that's a weird critique to say that you're too nice to any one group, unless the group is Nazis. Like that's a really strange critique. I mean, shouldn't we be kind?
Aaron Davis was nice to KKK people.
Yeah.
He was nice to the KKK.
Yeah.
Look what he did with that.
Yeah. It is a strange thing, and I think kind of beneath there, something I'm thinking about, or beneath that critique, is I'm thinking about what these positions. I think there's an interesting idea that I've heard before about ideas, which is that ideas are not something that people hold, but something that hold people. In other words, an idea, once it comes into your mind, has a very formative effect on you. What do you think are some of the character forming effects of holding deep, in a very deep committed way, holding one of these positions, whether it be colorblindness and racism? I had Thaddeus Williams on the show to talk about his book, Confronting Injustice Without Compromising Truth. I think you endorsed that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And in there, in his book and in the show, we talked about the personality and character impact that holding some of these, like you said before, woke ideas have on people. What do you think? Have you witnessed how these ideas, whether it be the colorblindness or anti-racism, holding on to them just extremely tightly, being deeply committed to them religiously? How have you seen that affect people, not just in their approaches to racial issues, but also in their character and personality?
Yeah, I think in both cases, although for different reasons, obviously, these ideas really, really feed into some of the needs they have, be it racial needs, be it political needs, be it whatever needs. And so I think that's a motivation to hold on to this. For people who are colorblind, there's a political motivation, sometimes a racial motivation to ignoring institutional racism, so that you have to deal with it. And so I think that helps to shape a person, because I'm holding on to this idea because it serves me. It takes care of certain needs that I have. And I think the same thing could be said about anti-racism. Anti-racism serves certain needs that people of color have. So in that sense, that's how I would characterize how the ideas can drive the human. And it gets back to human depravity. We're going to tend towards the ideas that help us the most. And that's human. Once we understand that, then we can understand that to be a child of God, we try to move away from that. And that's why I argue that this mutual accountability approach really is a Christian approach. It's, I can present on this and never mention a Bible verse, never mention, the Bible or anything like that, God, Jesus, anything. I have research to do that with. Having said that, I think that this ultimately is a Christian approach, because in a Christian approach, we understand how fallible we are. Therefore, we need others to check us. So that's how I would approach this, and that's how I approach that concern.
Yeah, I know that we're running close to the end of our time here, but I do want to touch on that before we go. What is your biblical and theological support for mutual accountability?
So the way I look at it is, one of the key differences between Christians and people who are more secular is, what is the nature of humans? Are humans perfectible, or are humans depraved? Because in the Enlightenment movement, there's a great movement towards human perfectibility, that if we change culture just right and we socialize people just right, we will create a society that's going to be a paradise, because humans are perfectible. We are the pinnacle of evolution. We have abilities and ways of coping and adopting and mastering. Or are humans depraved? I think the latter is true. That we're not perfectible. We can get better, but we're not perfectible. That our sin nature holds us back, and that we can't ultimately trust our own opinions, because that sin nature inhibits our objectivity. We want what's good for us in our group, and not necessarily what's good for others. If you assume perfectibility, your task is to find the perfect society, the perfect values, the perfect norms, and then to sort of socialize people to accept that. If you assume depravity, you can't trust your ability to find these perfect norms, because you're depraved as well. So you have to crawl together, walk together with other depraved humans, hoping that you can see weaknesses in them and they can in you, and you can move closer to a better solution. So if I was to do Bible verses, there'd be Bible verses on human depravity. all of sin falls short of the glory of God, verses like that. But the philosophy behind depravity versus perfectibility, I think, is what makes this a more Christian approach.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that the calling that we have in Scripture to being all a part of the body of Christ, understanding that we're all stones being built up into one temple of the Holy Spirit, understanding that we have the gospel, which takes people who are once separated, brings them together, unified in the body of Christ, two men into one, and that we are a temple that brought together is filled with the Holy Spirit. Since we have these resources as well, then we have the grace of God is like a safe context where we can come together in mutual grounds of that experience in Christ. And then we also have the aid of, I know this isn't something quantifiable, but we have the aid of the Holy Spirit working through whenever we pray and worship together to bring unity so that we can have humility and open-mindedness in these conversations.
Yeah, I agree. I thought about this as concerns racial issues, but the more I think about it, this is such a huge dividing line between secular ideology and Christian ideology that it would really change so much of how we see things, how we try to solve problems, if we recognize the depravity of humans rather than thinking that we got the answers and we can create this perfect society. And unfortunately, a lot of damage has been done trying to create utopias.
Yeah. Yes, a lot. Well, a lot more we could get into, but that's why the book is coming out. And so people can get the book. Go ahead and pre-order it so you can get your copy by March 15th, if not a little bit earlier, if the publisher gets it to you quickly, so you can read George's book. A lot of great stuff in there, and ideas and thoughts, which I think are grounded in biblical wisdom and can help us to move forward so we don't get caught up in, like you talked about earlier, the cycles of hot and cold tensions and so on. So, George, I just want to thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Once again, here on Filter, as always, I loved our conversation. I got a lot out of it, and I know that our listeners will too.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. I hope this episode provided you with biblical clarity to live with confidence in our confusing world. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To catch up with the latest from me, you can go to my website, aaronchamp.com. While you're there, subscribe to my newsletter so that you can be updated anytime I share new content. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Aaron M. Champ. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Until then, hold fast to the anchor.